Hi and welcome to the Machine Ethics Podcast. This month, with the imminent legislation of GDPR coming in the European Union on personal data, we talk everything personal data with Ruth Coustick Deal. From consent, data being part of you, the digital human, the Facebook debacle, GDPR and its intricacies for businesses, the fact that data might not be neutral, and wrong assumptions for analysed data. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can find us at machine-ethics.net, or you can send an email to hello@machine-ethics.net. You can also support us or sponsor us on patreon.com/machineethics. I hope you enjoy. Ruth, thank you for joining me on the podcast this month. If you could introduce yourself to the listeners, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ruth Coustick Deal. I'm a digital rights specialist and campaigner. I work in the field around internet rights and have been doing so for the last 7 years, and I work on issues to do with free expression and surveillance on the internet, and I also co-run a podcast called The Intersection of Things, where me and my co-host Marianela Ramos Capelo talk about internet issues from a intersectional feminist perspective.
Great, and I've been listening to the podcast, and it's been I think there's 4 episodes now as of this episode.
Yeah,
there
I
should
think
be
so.
more out soon, and they've been really good because they're kind of talking about privacy and feminist issues, but it's a lot to do with kind of the wider world. It's not really a microcosm. Obviously, it's all part of the internet and part of things that are in the news right now, and it's been really interesting. Your guys' take on that, so that's good. So I recommend that. Check it out. So I got you on the podcast, Ruth, because machine ethics, we normally talk a lot about AI and how AI in the future and now is affecting society and what kind of things we are likely to see. And a lot of that seems to be chatter around losing jobs. And some of that is also around data and personal data and data bias and all these sorts of things. So I was really excited to have someone who is passionate and excited about privacy and personal data and fights for rights to come on the show and talk more about all the things surrounding personal data and not just the internet, but kind of algorithms and such. So I was wondering, there's a lot to talk about there, but could you give us a quick definition of kind of like the major issues or things that we were talking about when we were talking about personal data and rights surrounding those things?
Wow, yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. I mean, one of the key things that I'm always talking about around the use of data is basically framing everything in terms of consent. So I understand that there are a lot of different ways that people use data at the moment. Like some of this is used by companies. There's the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal around how data that people gave on Facebook was being misused by a company. And there's also obviously like personal data that's used by institutions, by the health service. So, and there's also like researchers. Everyone is doing different things with data, and using data is definitely in and of itself not a bad thing. And there's a lot of like really important things that people are doing. And in fact, a lot of the ways in which we talk about gathering data, sometimes it's framed as though it's all problematic to have data on people, but it can actually lead towards visibility when you gather data on things that aren't known about or aren't seen. So how we gather data and how you treat the data you have on people, which is like anything about themselves, like any kind of like identifying personal information about your life, about your family, your political views, your height, all of that stuff is the kind of data that we're talking about. And there's a lot of opportunities that people have with it. It's all about making sure that when you're using people's data, you have real, informed, unambiguous consent for what you're doing, and that you put people like in the driving seat of how their data is used. And I can just sort of keep talking about how much I have this like real drive around getting people to understand that like data about yourself is part of yourself. Like, even though you don't legally own it when a company has created data about yourself, I would say that like I'm trying to think of what the phrase is, almost like morally, it's still part of you. And there are enough other protections and rules that give you that control. So you need to make, like, we all need to make sure that we're still like claiming that control and making sure that companies don't overstep their boundaries, and that we say like, no, this is part of myself, and like these are the things that you can and can't do with the data. And it's like, it's so much better to say like, I want my data to be used in this research in this way that I've consented for, and I'm happy to see that, and I can't wait to see the outcome of that research, than have, you know, someone trick people into handing over their data
Mm.
of all of their friends for research and then sell that data on to a dubious company.
Okay, well, I've made some notes, and I just feel like there's just so much stuff to talk about. So if we peel things back slightly and go, what is it about this data that's valuable? Okay, so I'm really interested here. People talk a lot about personal data and it being important and being used in nefarious ways by companies, or by black hat hackers or other people. What is it that's inherently valuable about this information, and then leading on from that, um, how does that value depreciate? Is there kind of a lifetime to this data? Is this data always valuable, or does it have some sort of kind of time limit, or is it some data better than others? Tell us about the kind of the value inherent in that data. Why are we getting upset about this?
That's interesting. I mean, I think there's different understandings of value. I guess you could look at it from like a capitalist perspective, that at the moment, our current system is that data has a value in the way it can be used to sell people products. Data has value in creating profiles and marketing to people based on the profiles created from that data. But data also has, I said, a value for research, because it allows us, the more information we gather, it can be used for medical discoveries and that kind of thing. That once
Yeah.
you have like mass sets of data, it allows you to look at things in a brand new perspective. But it also has like personal value, because it's about understanding information about yourself. Um, it's about the protection, like the value of your own, of yourself. Like we have value as people, and therefore like all like sorry, and therefore
Mm.
all data that's gathered about us is inherently valuable. And there are obviously a lot of other ways in which data is being used against people, not just in terms of companies who are using it for marketing, but you could also look at surveillance systems. You could look at like government and surveillance capitalism, and how it's
Mm.
really important to be able to control the way that's used. Like there was a scandal recently about how Grindr shared some data about HIV status of users on their platform with another third-party company, and they didn't apparently mean to do this. They were sharing a whole data set, and that was just part of the information they shared. And I
Mm.
think it should be like really obvious why that is really valuable. Like there are so many societal judgments we make about people's medical status like that. And also it can be like used against you. It's very dangerous. Like in those kind of situations, it would be great if you had a system where you could look at the data that the company holds on you and say like,
Mm.
yeah, you can share this with these people, but definitely never this. Like that area of data should be like cut off and protected.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we have a start. I mean, starting, but we have some sort of idea of how that works already. When you maybe use Facebook and you have an app connect to it, and it says we want to share this much information with this other third party that you're trying to connect with, and it'll give you some options. And sometimes you can amend those things, and sometimes you can't. In order to connect that application to your data that is held by Facebook. And is that the sort of thing that you want to see kind of across the board? So, like, if I had an application that had some information about its users that I could transparently just tell you somewhere that I hold these data points on people, and so there's no ambiguity there.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that more apps are doing this. You know, when you download something on Android, you can have things that select which permissions you want it to give.
Mm.
And you have camera, body settings, access to your text messages, all of that stuff. And I think that should definitely be the default across like most applications that you're downloading.
Like an applications, that's kind of like tracking, but I think, as you pointed out, there's third party companies that have information or buy information or hold information, and those are people also liable to have different data points, and it'd be nice to have some transparency there as well, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there are so many projects that are working towards this kind of thing. Like having a system where you can actually see what the company has on you. Like at the moment, you don't
Mm.
really understand what Facebook has. You can actually do a subject access request and ask Facebook for a copy of all the information that you have. And lots of people have done this, and it comes in huge reams of paper. And I've seen people do
Mm.
stunts where they like pour all of the information out of the window of a skyscraper to have it like drop all the way down to show how much it is. But it would be great if there were ways of like having aggregate versions of that, so you could see summaries of the
Yeah.
kind of thing. You could see the way they've marked you in profiles,
Mm.
like how have they determined what kind of person you are? What kind of ads have they decided they're feeding you with? Like that's the kind of
Yeah.
information that people need to be in control of. I mean, there are a lot of things I would suggest that Facebook do to put people like back in the driving seat. I'd like to just see simple programs within Facebook that let you mass leave groups or like mass
Mm.
unlike pages, because Facebook uses your likes to create a profile of you and decide how you will be targeted with things. So being able to
Yeah.
just see what are all the likes that Facebook is using would be really powerful, I think. So you could see that aggregate picture. So you wouldn't think, oh my God, that one time I accidentally clicked like on Oreo cookies. That's the reason why they think I want to vote for this political party or whatever it is, you
Yeah.
know.
And it might be that you click like, 6 years ago on something and forgotten, or it's not relevant to you anymore. And somehow, like, I'm really interested in this idea of how things can catch up with you as well. And I mean, through some of this data collection, you as like a human being and a digital being are being constrained in changing your mind and evolving into, this new person, when all these data points are being collected and are historical and are not forgotten. Kind of like, I feel like we're in this position now that we're, as a human being, we are being told we're one thing and we keep changing and evolving into this other thing. And we're leaving all this historical trail, which is saying, no, that you're this past thing. And you're like, no, I'm not that past thing anymore. I've moved forward. There's a little bit on that from Trotsky, who does stuff with the BBC and writes and has a book. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that kind of like the digital human sort of aspect of this as well.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I often worry about how much young kids, babies, people growing up right now are being put online without their consent by their parents. I mean, maybe you could say more about your choices
Mm,
with that as a dad, but
sure,
I think
sure.
it's strange, you know, there's that point when you're a baby and it's like, okay, cute baby pictures. But then as someone grows up, where's the line where you stop saying, well, this is a cute baby and babies kind of all look the same. So if someone found a baby picture 12 years down the line, sorry, mate. But you know, it's less identifiable. But then when you've got like a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, when are you going to say, do you want to be on my Instagram? Do you want to be on my Facebook? I did
Yeah.
notice that there is something in the GDPR that says that if your parents consented to a use of your data of your photos when you were a child, that when you're 18, you can request the deletion of anything that your parents consented to, because it's not real consent if you didn't make a choice about it, which I think is really interesting.
Mm-mm.
And there are more and more things I think being directed towards allowing young people to make that choice to recognize that what you posted on Facebook which is weird, I think, honestly, young people having Facebook profiles, but maybe I'm too old now, um, to allow you to delete that or change it. But honestly, you grow up so much in your 20s. I mean, I have learned so much and I've changed my mind on so many things. I know what you mean. There is this thing that's referred to as the right to be forgotten, um,
Yep.
but it's quite controversial. I I know many people in the digital rights world that I'm part of are very strongly against it from a free
Mm.
expression perspective, because it can be manipulated and used to hide really important information. It can be used by, public figures to make sure people can't find out about past scandals of theirs. Sorry, I realized I jumped forward without
Mm.
explaining to the listeners about what that is. It's essentially a proposal, a law that was passed in the European Union a few years ago now, that allows people to request deletion from search results of information that comes up with their name. It's very specific because it doesn't allow the actual deletion of the original web page, wherever that information is. It's about
Mm.
having that information not show up in search results. And in some cases, I do think it's been very useful. I remember reading one story about someone whose father was a pedophile, and that information came up when someone Googled his name. And this
Mm.
meant that it was always being associated with him, something that this person wanted to move on from. And I was like, you can absolutely understand how justifiable it seems in that situation to ask for that to be
Yep.
removed. But there are also many other situations where it seems like it's being used to like cover up news stories and to bury important information. And I think the actual real problem with it is about who decides what's taken down or not, and that's Google. And that's like we're then letting a company make these huge judicial decisions about what is or isn't published
Yep.
online. And I think really your opinion on whether or not it's good or bad comes down to weighing up privacy versus free expression. And I think
Yeah.
people just draw that line differently.
I think it's tough because coming from a more technical side, you're not letting people decide, a company decide who can publish necessarily, because anyone can publish anything on the web. But it's about the finding stuff on the
Yep.
web, and the default way of finding stuff is through search, and that's quite often Google. So it's a strange distinction, but I mean, you can use the web without Google. Um, it's hard if you use Chrome browser, for example, because it defaults to searching whatever you type into it. Um, do you have any feelings against for any of the other search engines like DuckDuckGo, things which are prioritizing privacy and user, not taking user data as you're searching and using their services?
Yeah, I mean, unsurprisingly, I use DuckDuckGo as my main search engine.
Mm.
Um, and I also have a system set up where I use a separate browser to use Facebook than I use for anything else, so they can't track me around the web. Um, I mean, if I was going to give my product review on DuckDuckGo, I would say that I don't think I always get the best results. Like sometimes I do end up searching for things on Google when I can't find it on DuckDuckGo. But I like that it
Hmm.
gives me neutral results. Like the whole thing that it can do is it doesn't give you results based on everything else you've ever searched for. And sometimes it's interesting to do comparable searches, search for the same thing on both and
Yep.
see what comes up. And I like that DuckDuckGo has like little features where you can do like exclamation mark T with a word and it does sends you to the thesaurus. Like I like its product features, but this is not a DuckDuckGo advert. So
No, but check it out. You can install it on Chrome and Firefox and use that as your predominant search engine, which I also do for privacy reasons. I mean, we talked a little bit about it, or we alluded to it earlier. You were talking about kind of privacy and GDPR. So GDPR is something that's coming in this month,
May
next month. May, so very shortly. And I have been talking to some of my clients about it, who have come forward and asked me how they can prepare for GDPR. But I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview of what GDPR is and what kinds of things that you think are really good about it.
Yep. So GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It's also a
Hmm.
European Union regulation, and it's an update to existing data protection laws. So we actually already have the Data Protection Act in the UK, which also is an implementation of a previous European data protection law. This is re-looking at all of that, given the internet and everything that has come with it, and updating it. I'm a huge fan of the GDPR. I'm a nerd fan of the GDPR. I will confess I also was part of the campaign for it. Um, like I was involved with some of the things that we wanted to ask for in it, and I
Right.
I'm trying to think where to start. I'm
Mm.
a fan of the fact that it really emphasizes consent, which I mentioned earlier is something that I value a lot. I'm really excited about the fact that if you read the definition of consent in GDPR, it could just as easily have been written by a feminist sex educator because it talks about consent being specific, informed, unambiguous, and indicated by a clear statement or affirmative action. Like consent cannot be implied. And all of that stuff I think is just really powerful. It's saying like you can't just assume that you can have permission to use people's data. And there's a lot of other like key points in that, like you can't do things with people's data that they couldn't reasonably expect.
Mm.
And then there's a lot more stuff about like the rights that you have. You have more rights to see your data, to access it, to be able to move it between companies. There's also this stuff about how like you can't give a detriment to not consenting. You're not allowed to punish people in any way for not consenting to using your data. So you can't even say things like, if you don't sign up to our mailing list, you'll miss out on great deals on lawnmowers, because that's actually manipulating people into signing over their data.
Or is that just presuming that the deals are great, or you know, maybe they are great deals on lawnmowers? How will we know if we don't
Because
sign
well,
up?
you are allowed to do it
Ah,
affirmatively. So you are allowed to say like, if you
yes,
sign up, you'll get access to great deals on lawnmowers. But you can't do it the other way around. You can't say like, if you don't sign up, it's about like punishing people for not
yeah,
consenting. You're allowed to encourage people.
yeah. So it's more of a psychological punishing. So it's you're tricking them into believing that they've done something wrong and that they want to fix it, rather than it's in their own interest to do whatever they like. I think I think that analogy is a good distinction. Actually, it's kind of like, you know, if you do this, we were going to give you X, but it's up to you to not do
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Like it seems like, well, it is semantics, but
Mm,
they're important semantics. I mean, I think so much of this seems very tedious and small to a lot of people, but every single part of it is actually making companies, I think, be a lot more responsible. I mean, people are saying that the GDPR is the best data protection in the world. Like, it's setting a new standard for the world. A lot of countries, Jamaica, Indonesia, India, are all looking at updating their data protection regulations to match it. Like, which means it's having this, like,
mm.
global impact. And that's also really exciting. Like I'm really hoping that there will be a knock-on effect around how companies around the world start changing their framing. And like I went to a workshop from the Information Commissioner's Office, who are the regulator for this law, and they really talked about how it's about framing everything you do in terms of trust and deserving that trust. You know, you're asking people to hand over something that is valuable, like exactly what you said, and that
Hmm.
they're trusting you with
Yep.
that, and you have to then deserve that trust, and it's just about a much better relationship than I think something that we've seen for the last like decade really, which has been a lot more about manipulating people into giving over information without really explaining how it's used, and then people find that decisions are being made about them, you know, adverts or, profiles, electoral decisions. Um, like huge things are happening that people couldn't foresee. And that needs to change. And that's why I'm excited,
Mm.
because although I know a lot of companies are really angry and like, oh God, all the work we have to do. Um, and I know that's tough right now, but I think that is like respecting your customers is part of the cost of doing business.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one of those things that hopefully it will, it will come into a norm, and the norm will be not tricking people, and having that trust, and only taking data that's actually necessary. There was a kind of an idea in the technology world that you kind of save everything, and it doesn't really matter what it is. You just save it, and it will probably be useful later on. And I think it's it's going to come to the point where we have to start looking at those sorts of ideologies that are happening in technology and Silicon Valley and those places, and go, actually, we haven't been thinking about this. We don't need this data. We don't need it on all of these machines, which is an environmental thing in my mind as well. And we don't need to do these profiling people. We are a company that we're providing this experience, and actually, we can charge people, and we can change the way that we work, and we don't need to be making our money on the side people as products. We can actually be making money by supplying something people actually want, actually want to engage with and can pay for. I think it's going to be kind of an interesting shift to see if there are many different types of business models that have to change, because they can't sell people's data all the time under these sorts of new regulations, which I think is just fantastic, right? We're not going to be sold
Yeah.
off all the time, hopefully. Yeah. So moving on to kind of infringing trust, in the news at the moment, there's Cambridge Analytica, which is big, and was a massive piece in the Guardian for couple of weeks, I think, in the Observer, and then and all over the news, basically, because of what came out of Cambridge Analytica and the types of deals they had, and types of work they were doing, trying to manipulate people to win elections, right?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. So how do you feel about kind of the coming to light of things that we kind of probably knew were happening, but then getting to the bottom
Yeah,
of
I
it?
mean, I am so glad that we actually are having a huge conversation about it. Some of this stuff, yeah, I think people definitely knew about how there'd been a lot of profiling. I know that Tactical Tech, who are a pretty cool organization who do work around personal security and giving people tools to stay safe online, um, had done some really interesting research and reports that had talked about this aspect of these profiles, because Cambridge Analytica weren't overly hiding that was what they were doing, like, because they'd been doing like presentations like hire us so we can fix the election. No, that isn't what they said. But they were like
No.
trying to sell their services, and so people already knew that they were saying, well, we can divide people into these kind of types and categories. And it's
Yeah.
not just, left or right wing. It's about whether people are like optimistic or pessimistic. Um, it's about how people interrelate with each other. Do they like value family or society more, and that all of that stuff. And they were saying we can divide everyone up, and then we can predict what kind of adverts will trigger them into voting in specific ways. But where they got all that data from to make this amount of detailed profiles is actually huge news, because they're saying that the data was 50 million people that they got from this research. 50 million people is not that
Yeah.
much short of the entire population of the UK. That is more than many countries' population. Like, they had all of that, all this information on, as we talked about earlier, people's likes, people's behaviors on Facebook, and we're using that to create these profiles, which, when we're talking about things you can reasonably expect to be done with your data, like, nobody could reasonably expect
Mm.
that. And it's just making manipulation part of our political system
I think that would all be fine if this data was sitting around not being actioned in any way. But I think that where we take that step into maybe something which is, becoming legal, and that next month is the way that Cambridge Analytica were taking these profiles and actioning those things into manipulating how people voted, right?
Yeah, I mean, the data gathering in the first place shouldn't have been legal because the kind of one of the core parts of the controversy here is that someone, a researcher, Alexander Kogan, had made a personality test app that was one of those Facebook apps back in the day when everyone was playing Farmville. And
Mm.
the app, when you asked to play it, asked for permission to access your personal information and also gave information about your Facebook friends. So it wasn't even about did those people expect their data to be used in this way. Those people consented to something, but their friends were never even given the
Yeah.
opportunity to consent. And that's how they got that 50 million. So the way they obtained the information was dubious, dodgy,
Hmm.
unethical, if even if it was legal at the time, which I'm not sure that that even would be legal in the Data Protection Act, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm just gonna raise my eyebrows. Um,
She is. I think maybe we should get a lawyer on this show at some point to talk through much of this sort of thing, because it is quite interesting. And though that bit of the case is historical, I think if you were, projecting what you might be able to do with that information, then you would obviously not
yeah,
consent to that point. You would say, no, like this is too much of my information, or too much information about the
yeah.
people I
I
know.
mean, it almost seems like just holding that amount of people's information shouldn't be okay because it's just such a huge data set. It's like asking to be used in the wrong way. It's also like a huge security risk.
Mm,
I mean, even now, the question is, what have they done with that data? They've been asked to delete it. I mean, that's another key
yeah,
part of it. They were actually asked to delete that data in 2015 by Facebook, but they didn't provide any proof that they had deleted it.
yeah. I mean, that is such a ridiculous thing to happen in this technology world now. Like, um, how easy is it just to duplicate files?
Yeah,
I
and how
mean,
hard is it to truly delete something? I mean, you ask that even
yeah,
just on your
exactly.
own computer, you delete something and then it's in your recycle bin, and if you delete it from there, there are still ways of getting it back again.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to know about that, you can actually retrieve deleted data, because how it actually works on your hard drive is it gets unlisted and then written over at some other time in the future. So if you relist your hard drive again using a bit of software, you can re-find all those files. So that's how it actually works in the technical aspect of it, if anyone's interested in knowing. But yes, it is ridiculously hard especially when you have things on the cloud, like Facebook and Google, all these services not only are cloud services, but they also own the hardware which runs those cloud services and have them all over the world. So they are constantly duplicating this information. So it's very difficult to delete anything that's on those services for a start, as well as having a big collection pool like Cambridge Analytica did. Um, so do you think they are? I mean, obviously they are putting together a case against them at the moment, but do you think GDPR and things like this are going to be the frontier of making sure that these things don't happen again?
Yeah, I do. Well, I think there's a combination of things to answer your question about that, because
Hmm.
one of the other aspects of the GDPR that's new is increasing the ability of the regulator to fine companies. They did have an ability before, but it was quite capped. It was a monetary cap, whereas now it's about a percentage of profits.
Yep.
And so,
And it's quite a large. It can
yeah,
be a quite
and
large
I
amount, can't
think
it?
that is
Yeah.
the threat is present, and I think that like encourages good behavior to a degree. It's disappointing that fines
Hmm.
have to be what does that, but it's there. Um, and I also think though that actually the government stepping up and demanding better, like the government interviewing these companies, like having Christopher Wiley, having Christopher Wiley come in and speak to them about it and like actually pay attention to what is going on is really important. I would prefer that they would actually confront the question about whether or not the entire Brexit
Mm.
vote was legal. But I realised that our government is not really fond of addressing Brexit and having that right now.
Yeah. So if anyone's listening in a different country, Brexit, you may or may not have heard of, but it was something that happened in the UK, I think last year now, which was a massive swear word. And basically we were fooled into, or a lot of the country were fooled into believing in their bigotry and voting for leaving the European Union, which obviously myself and Ruth are saying was a bad idea. But regardless of what you actually voted, a lot of what was said during that time was now proven false. So we were being misled.
Yeah, and there's a lot of questions about whether money was spent according to rules and regulations about how money can be spent during referendums, and now there are questions about whether the data that was used was done so ethically and within the rules. So it's it's one of those things where the vote went the way our current prime minister wanted it to go, or at least the way she is tied into now, and I don't think is really willing to address those questions. But in terms of going back to talking about data in Cambridge Analytica, um,
Yeah.
I also think that it is about having people be really vocal like this. Like when there's this much public attention, it is forcing companies to like go, oh, we can't just carry on. Like I think that stories that used to just be in Tech Dirt or Wired magazine that a few people were
Yeah.
reading about now are making it into the main papers. Like that's also really important. It says that people are not just going to kind of go, oh, that's a tech story. Because that divide between the tech press and the main press is just like ever disappearing. Because the tech stories are affecting our lives. So why should they be dealt with just in like a niche press? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, most of the time they're not talking about the technical, they're talking about technology. And I think that's maybe a distinction there. They're not talking about the code or the hardware, but they're talking about how people use it or how it's being used or the business of using these things. Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you, what would you tell businesses who are worried about this the GDPR coming in and where they should be able to read and learn more about maybe good practices or get involved with some of the work that you do?
Well, in terms of understanding about the GDPR itself, I think that the ICO actually have really good guidelines on their website, and I think that they're very helpful. I found them really good to just call up and ask questions to. They've been doing a bunch of workshops around the country to help people understand how it works in relation to their business. They actually have guides in relation to different
Hmm.
kinds of businesses. Um, and I think a lot of people are panicking, and I think there's a fair amount of scaremongering about how much this is going to have to change everything. Like people are saying, like, oh, you'll have to hire new staff, but you don't
Yeah.
actually have to hire a data protection officer if you don't have a business over like a certain size. Um, so like if you are a small business, it isn't as scary as all that. And if you've been following the Data Protection Act already, it's not as substantial a change as I think some people are making out. Um, so that's
Mm.
great. I would also recommend looking at some of the writing that Access Now have on data protection. They're an international human rights organization, and they've got some really good blogs that talk about it and explain stuff to do with GDPR in a really accessible way. Open Rights Group also do similar work that's really interesting blogs about it from like a human rights perspective. If you want to kind of read more about
Yeah.
those angles on it.
Great. So it's ico.org.uk. I've actually read quite a bit, and it's been very easy to read. Actually, there's some terms which you have to get your head around, but it's very readable. Um, they are very nice. And I send them an email and they reply to me, which is fabulous. That's what you want, isn't it? So that's great. Um, I I think we should talk a little bit about
Ooh.
AI, if that's okay. Um, yeah, so on the podcast, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, and a lot of the algorithms inherent in machine learning, AI, are data hungry algorithms. They perform better if they have massive volumes of information thrown at them, so that they can crunch through it and produce these models, right? So this somewhat flies in the face of kind of data protection in some ways. Obviously, it depends on what you're talking about. But if the more we try and apply these algorithms, and you can quite easily think about things like face identification, this kind of Orwellian style privacy issues, and that is very different from what we're seeing coming in with GDPR. Do you have any kind of thoughts about how we maybe traverse this kind of oxymoronic issue?
Yeah. Um,
I mean, you
Now,
can say
one
no, it's
second,
fine.
because
Yeah.
I am sure that there is something, and I'm just trying to check what it is. Yeah, so there is a
Hmm.
section in GDPR that says that the data subject has a right not to be subject to a decision made solely based on automated processing, and that includes profiling.
Hmm.
I mean, it does say solely on automated processing, which means you are allowed decisions that are based on automated processing and then a person at the end. But it does recognize
Mm.
already how much automated processing and like what you're talking about, I think a little bit, these kind of things with like facial recognition. That's using that if you use a facial recognition system and then use that to arrest someone, that's also something that
Yep.
GDPR is saying isn't allowed.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think that's a good example. Coming back to kind of like saying no, already you get things like automating the process of having a credit check, and things like boring kind of things that people use to get mortgages, to buy cars and things like that. And under GDPR, it's saying that you have to have some human being look at this information in those circumstances as
Yeah.
well. Do you
It's
think?
really interesting that you mention credit checks because they've been going on for so long, but they are really quite dubious in the way that they make decisions about people's lives. Like, if we're going to talk about how you don't see how that decision's being made, I mean, people have for a long time criticized how untransparent that is. You know, you try and get a credit check on a mortgage and you're being refused and you don't know why. You don't get that chance to refute it, to say that this is based on some outdated information. Like that is actually an example of this automation that's been going on for a long time, and hopefully these new rules might give us a way to change old practices, not just to prevent new bad practices. I think people should be able to see what makes a credit check decision.
Yeah. So hopefully everything like that is going to become more transparent, or it's going to have an indication of where those decisions are coming from, and hopefully maybe have someone at the other end of the phone as well, because often you get these letters or just instant rejections, and you don't know why, like we were saying. I mean, that sounds ideal. Hopefully they got just over a
Yeah,
month to
a
sort
lot
that
of
out,
it
right?
is also about all of this stuff to do with like AI in terms of algorithms. Is like we need transparency about
Mm.
algorithms. Like we need to be able to see how these algorithms are built and the root of decisions they're making. I actually went to a talk recently from someone who'd built an AI machine learning system that was for analyzing court cases,
Hmm.
to look at how many court cases contain information relating to domestic violence. So it's a very specific tool. And they'd spent something like over a year building this thing, feeding in information to it. And then she was demonstrating how there were different points in it where you could look at the results and then you could say like how has this result come about, and it would show you the little snippet of the text and it would say it contains these words and these words, and these words have been flagged. as like whenever they appear more than this many times, then the algorithm says that the odds are that it's in this category. It was a really interesting tool. I will try and send you after this who it was who gave that, because I can't remember.
Yep.
So you've got it for your footnotes. But it was a demonstration not
Yep.
just about AI, but really she was showing you how you can build an algorithmic system that shows you how it's making its decisions. And that was like really, really interesting, because people say like, oh, these things are so complicated, how can anyone understand? But she deliberately built it in a way that allowed you to see the way decisions are being made.
Yeah, I think often these systems inherently aren't built like that, and there's a reason. There's also a technical reason how that plays out, but also there's lots of work in that field trying to, interrogate these algorithms either after they've created these models or in the making of the models. And I think that's a really good example of, like, from the start you're making a model which tells you about itself. And at the end of the day, everything is statistics in this field, really. So there's no real reason it shouldn't be able to do that, hopefully. And hopefully we should see more. Well, there's a lot of energy in that way at the moment. But it is quite difficult if you're using a black box system and then you're having to tell people why a decision's made. And perhaps, given that you won't be able to do that, maybe you shouldn't be using that system in that way, or you can't be using it to make hard and fast decisions about people's lives and about
I
people's
think there are some
livelihoods,
things that we really just need to place off limits. When people are talking about using machine learning to decide if someone will commit a crime, like a lot of, in the American prison system, they are already using systems to decide if someone will reoffend when deciding whether or not to let people out early. And how are those judgments made? Like, we need to think really seriously about what is the information that you're getting from there. If you're using a data set that's racist because society is racist, if you say, oh, well, our system says that black people reoffend more often, like, why is that? Is it that they offend more often, or is it that they're arrested more often? Like, there is...
Yeah. So you're almost using the algorithm in the wrong place in that
scenario. And it's just that data isn't neutral, I think, is another really key thing. Like, we think that facts can just be themselves and that they don't come with politics, and we can try and put off the idea of responsibility by saying an algorithm is deciding this, or like, no, this is just a data set. But if you want to take a data set about who gets ill or who gets arrested, and think that those are just neutral pieces of information and you can make judgments about people, you're not actually thinking about where does that data come from? Like, why is that data collected? Race is just such an obvious example, because if you look at a data set that tells you, certain people commit crime more often, or like certain people take drugs more often, and then the real question is, no, who gets arrested for drugs the most often? It's not accurate to who's committing crime. It's not a record of that. It's a record of who is arrested and who is tried and found guilty.
Yeah, they're two different separate bits of information.
Yeah, and we have to like look at every data set that we're gathering and say, no, what is this like really telling us?
Yeah, I think that's super important. And race is an easy one to pull out, but also gender, and also different types of, hierarchical people. In England, we have this kind of working class, upper class divide somewhat. And I think it's just really interesting how people are failing at understanding what you just pointed out. You could be using these algorithms to find out really useful information about, what is it about the fact that this certain population are getting arrested more or having more trouble with drugs or whatever it is. Why are we not interrogating that and making decisions that can make people's lives better, instead of maybe misusing that technology and making decisions on those people's behalf?
I saw another example, which was about university admissions, which was using machine learning to predict whether or not people would drop out early. And if they're looking at that and saying, oh, well, working class people drop out of university earlier, so we should stop accepting them because they're just a waste of our time. And yeah,
Wow,
the
that
question
is a
is no.
stretch.
If you look at your data set and it says this group of people drop out of university early, instead of not accepting them, you need to say why. What are we doing to fail those people and fix that problem? Instead of trying to say, let's try and come up with a system to only accept into university people who will see the course all the way through. And I'm really worried that just a lot of these systems are actually taking our society back there because they're reinforcing prejudice, not challenging it.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more people who are data scientists who are concerned with the ethical implications, or just are very good at their job. Because I mean, the things that you pointed out should be obvious to those people. That collecting the data is it's what's that saying? Like garbage in, garbage out. You know, if you're collecting garbage information and telling people making decisions on that garbage information, or bias information inherently because the way it was collected was nefarious, or was leading, or all these different types of things associated. And also, in my mind, just knowing, just accepting that data isn't the real world, or isn't the be all and end all.
Yeah,
It's
I think it's
statistics
accepting that
again.
data isn't neutral. I think people
Mm,
have a tendency in our culture especially to really believe that there's such a thing as like a neutral fact, and that there isn't, because there's too many things that contribute towards that data point.
hmm
But like I do think that what's exciting is people are asking these questions, like, you have a podcast about it, and I have so many books that I want to read
Yeah.
on this topic. I have that Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks on my to read list right now. I have a book called The Poverty
Mm,
of Privacy Rights, like, on my to read list. I know that people are interrogating these questions, and we've got like sociology professors who are working with technologists to try and develop these tools in a more ethical way. The people who work even at Microsoft in the AI department are like going to conferences and asking these questions and thinking about these things very critically.
yeah.
So it's like worrying the people who are leaping on the new tools without engaging, who are just saying like, oh, we can just use this data set to solve all our problems. Like, why bother with a court system when we could just ask the machine if this person should be in jail? You know, there are people who seem to think that we can just offset our
Mm,
lives onto AI, but I think most people who are really interrogating them are doing so thoughtfully.
great. So that is a fantastic sentiment to finish on. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish for the
Um,
day?
I mean, like, I'd thought maybe you'd ask about whether or not people should leave Facebook, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good. I think maybe we just need to accept that people don't need to use Facebook, maybe, and that
I was
they
gonna
should live their
say my
lives.
answer on that is
um,
is to say that it's not on individuals to make up for Facebook's failures.
yeah, no, that's really good. So,
No, I
have
actually
you
wrote an
left Facebook?
article on my blog a while ago, like well before all of this stuff, called "Facebook Has Its Claws in Me and I Want Out,"
Hmm.
and I wrote like a whole list of all of the things that Facebook has done that drives me mad. And I'm not talking about this Cambridge Analytica. I'm talking about like the way it censors images of women, the way it creates like a facial recognition database without people's permission, the level of colonialism it carries out,
Yeah,
introducing itself as the internet to a number of other countries, the way it collaborates with oppressive
yeah.
organizations and regimes in order to censor minority speech. Like, there's a really long list, and then I was just like, but I still can't leave because it's where life happens. And, you know, it's not just like, oh, well, I talk to my friends. Like, everything happens there. That's how you do stay in touch with people. It's like all the groups that you're in, it's like professional contacts. And I mean,
Mm,
fundamentally, it's just like it is part of our society right now. And when you opt out of it, you're opting out of everything else about being part of people. You're isolating yourself when you make that decision. And I do not like feeling like I'm complicit in their awfulness. At the same time,
yeah.
I think that people leaving doesn't impact Facebook. It's like trying to fix global warming on your own. Like, you are trying to do something, but you're not going to make a big difference unless like the major companies actually change their practices. And I think you need groups, like you need the regulators, you need the governments to call them to account and ask them to change their behavior. And you can do collective actions. You know, you can call on Facebook to try and get them to change, but it has to be done in a collective way. Like, even when you do a boycott doesn't work if you just privately decide, I'm not going to buy this company's product anymore, and they don't know why. You have to tell them why, and you have to do it as a group. You have to make it like clear that it's happening.
Yes, that is true. I feel like maybe it sounds like you're more tied to Facebook than I am. So that's interesting, isn't it? I think I could leave Facebook,
Wow.
And that would be fine. So, but then again, like you said, that's just me, and who cares?
I think people
about
need to make
me not being on
decisions
Facebook?
right for them. Like, if you can leave Facebook and be happy with it, then go for it. Like, great. But I don't think we should tell other people that like the right thing for them to do is to leave Facebook, because it's not.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it's not on individuals.
Yes, sure. I think we could go down a rabbit hole with this one, because I have a lot to say about general practice of social networks and the workings of these sorts of utility programs almost. But we're not going to go there quite yet. We'll maybe save that for a bumper cast, if I do that sort of thing in the future. Ruth, it's fantastic to have you on the podcast. I would love to talk to you more, but we are on about an hour now, so we'll let our listeners get on with their lives. If people want to follow you, contact you.
Yep, you can find me on Twitter as @Nescient, that's Nesient, or on my podcast, The Intersection of Things, which you can also find at theintersectionofthings.com or @thingsintersect on Twitter.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, thanks very much.